Brilliant. Well, what a pleasure it is to appear here at Goldsmiths Hall to share with you a few glimpses, snapshots, highlights from what's really a project in its infancy, but a project that I think I'll be taking with me throughout my entire life. I'm going to sort of jump straight in because we're talking about silver as a luxury product of consumption in Barbados, and where does this luxury trade come from? Barbados is a major colonial sugar economy based on a plantation system driven by slave labor. And by the end of the 17th century, sugar exports from Barbados actually outweigh all of the sugar exports from the combined continental colonies. So this really is a powerful sugar economy in the region, despite it being a small island, 166 square miles. The sugar planters were consequently some of the wealthiest people in the English-speaking Americas. And this is what made Barbados a serious export market for European manufactured luxury goods. The prospering planters and merchants sought to furnish their homes, not just for comfort, but to display this new wealth and status that came with their profits. We have an amazing quote by a visiting French priest, Father Billet, who visited the island in the middle of the 17th century and noted of the English on the island that they came here to be wealthy. This was the driving force for most of them to come. There was this potential to earn these huge sums of money. And they lived like little princes, gold watches everywhere, and some of the most extravagant luxuries from England and elsewhere could be found in the island's well-stocked shops. So as early as the 17th century, there's clearly a very established system of trade with merchants selling all kinds of luxury goods. And that includes goldsmiths, and we find the earliest mention of goldsmiths starting from the 1640s. And indeed, we do find silver mentioned in inventories from that period as well. So here's a map of the Caribbean, and Barbados is that little small island circled with a blue ring on the right-hand side. Geographically, it's predisposed to what it did become, which was a very important commercial center for transatlantic trade of all sorts. It was essentially the first stop on that transatlantic voyage. And so here on the left, you see a map of the island divided into 11 parishes. But we're going to be focusing our attention on the city of Bridgetown, the capital city, which is centered around a development at that Carlisle Bay harbor. It's a natural harbor. It provides the appropriate protection that meant that's where the ships were coming, bringing people, goods, and that's where a lot of our stories from today will be centered. And here's a painting that hangs in the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, mid-18th century, showing Governor Robinson going to church. Well, forget about the governor. Look at all those ships in the harbor. That's telling us part of our story. Look at the number of houses in that surrounding area. This is where all the action is happening. This is where our goldsmiths are. Smaller boats would have brought people and cargo ashore, and I like to use my imagination and think about the excitement of walking around those streets and thinking about what might be in the shops and warehouses one finds there. We can take some imagery from much later photographs, around 1900, of a couple streets in Bridgetown. We see those houses which would have likely had the shops downstairs with the owners living upstairs, and we can think 100 years earlier of what it might have felt like with those people walking around and shopping. And Alessandra beat me to it, this amazing quote from Father Labat, a French priest who visited the island in 1700. And he described Bridgetown as beautiful and noble. Everything appears to have an atmosphere of tidiness, civility, and wealth, which one doesn't necessarily see in the other islands. So here Labat is already distinguishing Barbados as the civilized island, as having something a bit special compared to the other islands he visited. He notes that the shops and all the merchants' warehouses are filled with everything you could want from all parts of the world. And so I think this makes a really important point, that what these prospering planters and merchants wanted was European luxury goods. They wanted to emulate the lives of the successful people back home. So they wanted objects made in London, for instance. Why did people want silver? Well, very much the same reasons as they do today. It possessed a social significance. Even owning a few items of silver would have said something about your social status, and they would have used silver in entertaining, in marking special occasions. It was also a means of storing wealth. And this is just one example of an inventory we found in the early 19th century, mentioning numerous silver objects. Here, domestic silver for the tea service, cutlery, and so on. And this matches very well with surviving advertisements we find in newspapers of the period of silver objects that were being offered for sale on the island. Going back to Father Labat, he continues to say, one sees many goldsmiths, jewelers, clock and watchmakers, and other workmen who all have a great lot of work to do, and they carry on one of the largest trades in the Americas. So this isn't an individual who happens to be hammering away at an odd spoon every now and again. This was a thriving trade, and we see one example of what is the earliest surviving watch made in the Americas here, a watch made by Francis Draycott in Barbados. It dates from about 1690, and we know it was made on Barbados, for Barbados, because of a clever silver engraved dial that indicates essentially AM or PM by displaying a sun or a moon, and that is calibrated for and only works in equatorial latitudes. So this was made for Barbados, where, of course, the daylight is quite constant during the year. So we turn our attention then to evidence of silver being retailed on the island, and these are just two advertisements from the local newspaper called the Barbados Mercury, which survives in the Barbados archives. And if we look at the advertisement placed by Benjamin Elkin on the left, one of the first things we notice is that the advertisement opens with Elkin explaining that he's imported these wares for sale, silver and jewellery of the latest court fashion. So again, appealing to his clientele who want to be emulating European fashion. He sells various things, various bits of jewellery, jewels, all kinds of silverware, cutlery, flatware, liquor stands, you name it, you can buy it in Bridgetown, Barbados in 1808. And he ends his advertisement by reassuring the customers that he sourced these goods from the most eminent jewellers in London. And here's a rather boring fiddle pattern fork. It's seen a bit of a life, but it was found in Barbados and bears the mark of Benjamin Elkin that he registered in London, overstriking the person who made it. And so it's just an example of something that may well have been retailed there, but the key thing is it's Elkin overstriking a London maker. The advertisement on the right by John Niles, again, shows various silver objects for sale, but he ends his advertisement by appealing to his customers to come and pay him some money. And I think it sort of highlights that this trade is operating, at least in part, on a credit basis, which is typical of the period. But it's another little snippet of information about how the trade works. So both of these advertisements would suggest that a considerable amount of plate was being imported onto the island, and certainly the broader West Indies, but just how much, and was it a sort of sizable market? And so if we look at the exports of silver from Great Britain in the year 1801, what we can see here is that the British West Indies as a whole, Barbados would have formed just a part of that, is, you know, the tallest bar on that graph, and certainly outweighs all of the plate being exported to the United States at that time. So this was a serious export market for plate. So we know a little bit about, from those advertisements, what's being offered for sale, those advertisements being customer-facing. But do we know anything about the back end of that process and how that silver was supplied? I've come across two different ways this operated. One would be retailers placing orders with West India merchants based in London who would have supplied the goods and shipped them down. And another is forming a direct agreement between a local retailing goldsmith in the West Indies who has agreement with some maker or retailer in England. And we'll look at evidence for both of those now. Here's a surviving billhead for John Kentish, who's a luxury goods retailer based in London, dated 1764. And the customer on this billhead is Innes and Hope, who are West India merchants based in London. And if we think about the implications of this, what it's telling us is if you imagine a retail customer in the West Indies, they would have approached a local silver retailer based on the island in the West Indies, who has written now to Innes and Hope to order some goods, who's approached John Kentish, who himself is a retailer, who therefore had to approach a working goldsmith to manufacture these goods. And the end of that really long sentence is, there are a lot of intermediaries, a lot of markups, a lot of commissions. These goods must have been so expensive by the time they made it to the islands. This particular billhead, I don't know which island these goods are destined for, but I think it's an archetype that we're going to see throughout all of the islands. It begs the question, does this open up a potential market for a local silversmith who certainly would be able, with the technology available, to make some of these objects much more cheaply than importing these through all of these intermediary merchants? And we'll come back to that a bit later. If we look at the details of the billhead, we see a variety of individual sets of cutlery. So it suggests that a lot of this was being ordered on speculation. You want to have something in stock to offer your customers. But if you look at item number 6, those spoons and ladle and marrow spoon have been engraved and personalized with a customer's crest and motto. So there was obviously also bespoke orders for individual customers. And so I think we're going to see both of those modes of operation at play. Looking towards partnerships between retailers in the West Indies and suppliers back home, here a surviving co-partnership deed exists in the Maritime Museum in Liverpool. It's an agreement between Robert Preston, who's a working silversmith based in Liverpool, and Henry Madden, merchant of Barbados. It's interesting that throughout the document, reference is made to the retailing of goods in Barbados and the West India Islands. And I think it makes a really, really important point that we need to bear in mind throughout today. We can't look at these islands in isolation. This was a highly interconnected region where people and goods were moving between islands and the American coastal colonies. Preston, based in Liverpool, receives 5% commission for organizing the goods and shipping them down, and then the net profits are split down the middle. And special thanks to Luke Schrager for helping me transcribe this very difficult document that I was struggling with for some time. Here's an advertisement dated 1810 in the Barbados Mercury for Henry Madden and Company, advertising all kinds of things for sale. And it makes an important point, which is that not all dealers of silver on the island would have been specialists. Madden is very clearly a general merchant selling anything that can make him money, silver just being one of those areas. And so he might have had partnership agreements with a whole load of different suppliers based in England to supply these goods. So the exciting question, was anything being made on the island? I kind of get to this question and think it'd be so nice to go back in time and just simply ask this question to someone. But I can get close. There's a surviving transcript for a trial at the Old Bailey concerning James Cray, who was robbed in a field by Jennings and Humphreys. And they took from him a pinchbeck watch, a carnelian seal, a pair of knee buckles, and a pair of silver shoe buckles. And when the judge asks, "Are these the buckles you were robbed of?" Cray says, "Yes, my lord. They're foreign make. I had them made in Barbados." So there we have it in black and white. And we love these ephemeral sources that things were being made on Barbados. So we've spent some time looking through various archival sources, including wills, inventories, advertisements in the local newspapers, levy books, and so on, and have assembled a list of goldsmiths working across the long 18th century. We have about 100 names so far, and we expect that these are going to be a combination of retailing goldsmiths, but also people working and marking their wares. How does this fit in with that retail trade that I introduced at the beginning of this talk? I still believe that the retail trade is what is dominating on the island, but there are reasons for a working trade to also exist alongside it and supplement it. So firstly, when supply is interrupted, whether through bad weather, hurricane seasons, wars, if orders come in at short notice, we can't sort of FedEx down the goods in the 18th century, and so sometimes you have to prepare things at short notice, but also to carry out repairs on worn out or damaged objects. And so I think the working silversmith on the islands is fulfilling these roles. So looking at one of the characters that we've come across, I think it presents an interesting case study to tell us a little bit about how the working goldsmith might have operated. Here's an advertisement in a local almanac on the island for Matthias Holst, who advertises himself as jeweller, goldsmith, and toyman on the island. He's late of Charing Cross, London, but now at the Pine and Pearl in Bridgetown, Barbados. He makes all sorts of jewellers and goldsmiths work, so very clearly a working goldsmith with the skill set to make things, but also retails. He has a constant and large supply of the most fashionable goods continually from London. I think this is the archetype, that these makers are hybrid retailers makers. I don't think anyone is just making things. I think if you're in this trade, you're going to be doing both. Where do you get people to work in your workshop? Here's one source. Holst obviously maintained connections with London and takes 2 child apprentices from Christ's Hospital in 1750 and 1751. So I don't think there's no formalized guild system, but clearly the idea of still taking apprentices is active on the island. What's perhaps more interesting is a surviving indenture for John Williams, who is bound to serve a goldsmith in Barbados called John Newlyn. And what's really interesting about this indenture is it spells out for us the understanding that Williams will teach in his capacity of working goldsmith all servants belonging to Newlyn. And this is when we get thinking about the fact that these aren't just European workers working in these workshops. Of course, they are going to be probably a mixture, but as time goes on, more and more enslaved goldsmiths with highly skilled skill sets, who could themselves carry out work, but also train others. And I think that's probably the economic driving force for this, is reducing the expenses overall of the skilled labor in the workshops. We, of course, know very, very little about these highly skilled enslaved artisans. The few that we know of so far appear in runaway slave advertisements. Sometimes their names aren't mentioned, they aren't described. The objects coming out of the proprietor's workshop were therefore the product of several hands, but if any, it probably will only bear the mark, well, almost certainly of the proprietor himself. So there are these invisible but highly skilled craftsmen, absolutely crucial to the trade, that we'd like to research more into the stories of. Looking at the advertisement on the left, we have Henrietta Meller, who is the widow of a local goldsmith who's winding up her husband's estate, and she advertises that she would like to sell her 2 enslaved goldsmiths, unnamed in this advertisement. And so I think it's showing us here that the focus on a lot of these advertisements is on the abilities and worth, but not telling us much about the people behind these skills. The advertisement by Thomas Burton on the right-hand side is in relation to his runaway enslaved artisan Content, and he is appealing to the public not to employ Content and asking for his return. So these artisans are clearly very valuable and very central to the goldsmith's trade on the island. I found this advertisement for a local goldsmith called Isaac Lopez most interesting, who is appealing to the public for information on his runaway artisan Gift. And I found it very interesting that he describes Gift as well known about this town and country. And so I think it raises an interesting question of, it challenges us to perhaps stop thinking about these artisans as shackled to a bench in the workshop. But if Gift is well known about this town and country, was he also interacting with other members of the trade, customers? In downtime, was he doing work elsewhere? Gift is very well dressed. You might say, well, were those items of clothing borrowed from his owner? But otherwise, actually, was he able to save up money on his own and he was able to dress himself based on work being done elsewhere once he'd met agreed rates to be returned to Lopez? Gift is clearly very valuable based on the reward offered. Doesn't appear in Isaac Lopez's inventory at the time of his death. So we don't know what happened to Gift, whether he never returned or whether he died before Lopez's death. And so this leads me into an area I really haven't looked into at all, but I think is going to be extremely important to be researched, which is the topic that was raised earlier about freed artisans in these skilled trades. On attaining one's freedom, it's often that these enslaved artisans did continue in the occupations that they had mastered while enslaved. And so almost certainly we'll find more and more evidence of free people leading these trades on. I'm aware of just one reference so far to a free goldsmith, and this is in the will of a free person, William Newton, who leaves to his good and esteemed friend, William Nunez, a free mulatto goldsmith, his house. It's interesting that an American present in the island in 1814 notes that all of the light and mechanical trades, including the goldsmith and jeweler trade, were being carried on by free people of color, so much so that there's local commentary on the island at the time that free people of color were outcompeting the white working class in these skilled trades. So these people were clearly going on to be very successful in running businesses in their own right. So that's a little bit of a background of the goldsmith trade in Barbados. And what we've done is assembled this list of goldsmiths that we're aware of. And the next step, with my collector hat on, that was how I really came to the world of silver, was through collecting. We, of course, want to attribute surviving silver work to some of these artisans. It's a challenging project, and each maker and each object that we match is a mini project in itself, and it's going to be the work of many years to come. But the first thing that I sought to do with my collector hat on was to develop a register of local silver that could be found in Barbados that wasn't yet attributed, knowing this was going to be a mixed bag of perhaps some locally made silver, but silver from other parts of the world that I had less knowledge about. And so I was very kindly invited to view several private collections and go through boxes and drawers of spoons and different things looking for unattributed objects. And so here's one example of a set of 5 spoons that I still can't tell you who made them, but you get these in the hand and you realize that they're of English style, so being made somewhere with English influence. The fact that there are 5 of them, there would have been more at some point, I'm sure, suggests that the operation is happening at some scale. They're engraved with the initials of the owner in a typically English manner, and they bear a maker's mark only, which isn't surprising because there's no local assay system in Barbados. So it presents enough of an opportunity to ask the question, could they have been made in Barbados? I think it's possible, but still waiting for the proof. And I've created a register of these types of objects, and here are just a few snapshots of things I've come across with marks, and you get them in the hand, and you handle enough of this stuff, and you can sort of get a sense. I hear myself saying, oh, this has a colonial feel to it, and I don't know when I developed that spidey sense, but you do get a sense for it. So one of the things I mentioned was that these objects often bear maker's marks alone, but you should ask the question, well, why are these people bothering to mark at all? And I think there are 2 main reasons. I think one is keeping track of the work, whether that's because of thefts, and there were many if you read the local 18th century newspapers, but also just if a customer is bringing something back to you or questioning quality, then you need some kind of record of knowing what came out of your workshop. And so that's the first reason. But I think a second and important reason is offering the customer some kind of reassurance on quality of the silver. The retail customer in those days, if they were used to buying goods from London, would have likely been aware that there were some kind of marks on the back that meant it was good quality. They mightn't have understood the details of what the individual marks were, but they expected to see something on the silver. And striking a maker's mark several times on an object at least offered that guarantee, and the guarantee being, you know, your reputation and assurance as the goldsmith they brought it from, rather than regulation, as was the case in London. There was clearly a local understanding of marking of wares, because if you look at the advertisements on the right, the first at the top is an advertisement by a local goldsmith called George Hialis, and he's intercepted 2 spoons and is advertising that he has these and they can be collected through paying for the advertisement. The first he specifies as being London made, and he goes on to mention the other, and so I get a bit carried away and think, does the other mean not London made, i.e. could have been locally made? The other spoon with the maker's name, AIH. Anthony Wilson, then in the advertisement on the bottom, advertises a terrible robbery where all kinds of things were taken, including 4 silver salt ladles, ciphered and bearing the marks Solomon Sterling. So these were clearly cork spoons that ended up in Barbados. But the key thing here is these advertisements are acting essentially as warning notices to other goldsmiths where these items might arrive at to be pawned, and so there clearly is an appreciation for and an understanding of the marks one might expect on silver on the island. So the last part of the talk now is for me to introduce just a few characters where we're pretty confident at the attributions we've made combining both archival material and surviving objects. And so I'll introduce you firstly to William Horsham. He's a local goldsmith in Barbados and appears to be the younger cousin of a goldsmith called Samuel Maynard Horsham. Now, Samuel Maynard, we know from the nature of his advertisements in the local newspapers, is making things. He has the ability to make things and to train people. And just as Samuel Maynard's business is in decline and he announces his retiring, William Horsham starts advertising that he's taken a house and taken up the trade of gold and silversmith. And we think it's likely, therefore, that William was working with Samuel Maynard and was probably trained by him and then goes out on his own at the time of Samuel Maynard's declining health. In addition to the announcement of William Horsham carrying on the trade of goldsmith, he's also advertising that he's retailing a number of silver items. And if you look at the range of objects being offered, this is clearly a much wider range than could ever be offered by a specialist maker. And so this hybrid setup of being a retailer and maker at the same time means you can offer a wide variety to your customers. So here's a spoon that sits in a local collection in Barbados that I came across. It's an Old English pattern spoon, around 1780 in date, which is around the same time that William Horsham is advertising. Wriggle work, bright cut borders, and engraved with owner's initials, and struck on the back, WH 3 times. And we propose here that this is the mark of William Horsham making this spoon locally on the island. This slide shows another 3 very similar spoons, also struck WH 3 times, here with a different punch. And it got me thinking about punches, of course, made of steel in a time when steel wasn't what it was today. And I'm thinking of that hot, humid, tropical weather that I grew up with, seeing steel rusting everywhere, knowing these punches are not going to last. And so you have a situation where makers are likely having marks cut every so often. And so here's an alternative mark. And if you look at the punches on the bottom right-hand side, you can even see where the punch is just breaking up, that chunk of steel that's out at the base of the punch. But here are another 3 spoons, again, that we attribute to William Horsham. We move on then to a partnership called Smithson and James. And you can find various advertisements in the local newspaper for Smithson and James. They announce that they have received from London all kinds of fashionable jewellery and plate for sale, suggesting that they're retailing. But they're obviously making things as well. They advertise for apprentices. They advertise for wanting to buy silver and gold. And they're intercepting objects that they propose to be stolen. And so they're therefore a central shop that people are bringing things to. So who are Smithson and James? How do you start finding out, with no first names, who these people are? I'll sort of tell this story in the chronology of how it all unfolded. So Smithson, a great candidate for Smithson is George Smithson, a Charleston silversmith. And so we'd gone this far saying this was almost certainly our guy. George Smithson advertises in South Carolina in 1775 that he makes all kinds of jewellery and gold work, swords, spoons, buckles, the works. He's clearly well regarded and highly skilled because he's commissioned to cut the silver Great Seal of South Carolina, shown on the right. But around the time of the War of Independence, Smithson, being a loyalist, leaves for the West Indies in 1778. This is a few years before those advertisements start popping up in Barbados. Smithson's a type of artisan with a skill set, clearly, that would be able to make things, to engrave silver, to himself probably cut punches, and certainly to train others. So we think this is a very good candidate for Smithson, but I couldn't figure out who James was. And James is such a common surname that it's almost impossible. And thank goodness, Robert came to the rescue. So Wynyard very kindly allowed me access to one of Robert Barker's notebooks from a research trip dating back to the 90s when he went to Barbados to look into West Indies silversmiths. And there the answer was in plain sight on a written account of a power of attorney for Thomas Walker, who was also a goldsmith in Barbados, which was witnessed by George Smithson and Alexander James. So we then had confirmation that we knew who our two characters were in this story. So here's some work by Smithson and James. Here's a pair of salts with a lovely beaded border around the rim, chased with laurels and flowers and standing on a square base. You'll be able to handle these later, I believe. And they are marked on the base with a somewhat worn punch, but you can just make out the S and J for Smithson and James on the base there. Here's a wonderful soup ladle, or is it a punch ladle for some local convivial beverage being enjoyed by the people of the time, but with a much clearer mark for Smithson and James. So look at the S and J struck 3 times on the back of this Old English pattern ladle. And finally, again here, with the same punch, S and J for Smithson and James on these 2 Old English pattern tablespoons. George Smithson dies in Barbados in 1789, and it appears that the firm is then taken over by what we can see in this advertisement here, the firm of Thomas and Alexander James. Research into Thomas and Alexander James is ongoing, but it would appear that Thomas is probably some relation of Alexander James himself. If we look at this advertisement, this really speaks to retailing, but then we look at the surviving material evidence for this partnership and find this set of 6 dessert spoons, beautifully bright cut in the Old English pattern and struck twice on the back on each of them with T and AJ for Thomas and Alexander James. We see a different punch here for this wonderful scallop shell soup ladle in the Old English pattern. Once again, T and AJ struck 3 times. So that's a bit of an overview of a few of the characters that we have attributed so far. There'll be more in the pipeline, and I look forward to sharing those in due course. But to conclude today's talk, it's likely that a retail market for European manufacturers was dominated on the island, but this was certainly supplemented by the active craftspeople on the island, including enslaved artisans and freed workers. A number of goldsmiths have already been identified, and as I mentioned, stay tuned for more. I think a really interesting thought and matter here is that progression of this project will almost certainly rely on the collaboration we've been talking about today, both of research academics, but also collectors. Look at the material evidence that's coming out of private collections, collaborating with museums, and so please do get in touch if you have anything you think is interesting or would like to collaborate on this project. I'd like to just finish by acknowledging a few people that have helped me tremendously along the way. First and foremost, Wynyard Wilkinson, who's been an amazing mentor, who has shared so much information with me and encouraged me along the way. This talk wouldn't have been possible without his help, so thank you, Wynyard. Luke Schrager and Mary Louise Wilkinson for transcription and photography help along the way. Robert Barker, who continues to help all of us, which is amazing, and for making today possible. Friends and family and colleagues in Barbados who welcomed me into their private collections and offered me encouragement, and of course the Silver Society and the Goldsmiths Company for making this conference today possible. And finally, thank you, the audience, for listening.
Oh. Who needs me? I think that was totally riveting. Well done.
Thank you.
And I think I don't even need to say anything. But thank you very much, Luke. That was perfect. Really fun. A bit of everything. Great follow-ups of Catherine's really interesting talk, so it all goes together. And so please now, over to you again for questions. Hands up, please. Yeah. David? Oh,
I'm here, actually.
Oh.
Question is, in looking at the formation of local retail shops, do you have any evidence for rental, that people are renting these items from the retail shops locally?
That's such an interesting question, thank you. Because clearly, I mean, we touched on earlier that, you know, silver had this social significance, and so I can see where people who didn't own it might have wanted to have a bit of it. I haven't found any evidence for it. Okay. It's also not something I've looked for, but I think that's a really interesting idea, and we'll definitely look into that.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. David.
It's a very nerdish question, but the maker's mark for the Smithson and James, the unusual ampersand, is that repeated in the other punch as well, which I couldn't quite see?
Yes, so it's that sort of Scottish ampersand, isn't
strange,
it?
yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you. You mentioned a Robert Preston, not Robert Peston, I should emphasize, of Liverpool, who was exporting to Barbados and via Henry Madden.
Yes.
He was getting Sheffield plate from Matthew Bolton in Birmingham. But my question is, do you know if plated wares of any sort, French plated, close plated, Sheffield plated, silvered even, were being made in Barbados, or were all such goods being imported?
I have no evidence for any of that being made in Barbados, but definitely if you look at the advertisement in the newspapers, it is being imported and sold, yes. It's not an area I've focused much on, the plated wares, but certainly if you go around private collections in Barbados, I mean, there's a ton of Sheffield plate surviving, and there are things that are quite unique to the West Indies and the Americas more broadly. For example, candlesticks with glass shields, because of course the houses are open with the wind blowing through, and so you need that protection from the shade. So almost certainly things are being imported, yes.
Thank you.
Luke, that was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. You mentioned you had a spidey sense about the silver there. It's not very specific. Can I push you on that? Is there something about the engraving or maybe the decoration, the chasing, that makes you think something might be from Barbados?
Sure, it's a good question and an answer that's really hard to put into words, but I'll try. I guess to answer the engraving question specifically, yes, there tend to be these sort of decorative flecks and sort of stylized lines on the initials that, not all of the time, but quite a lot of the time do appear on pieces from the islands broadly. So that's part of it. The other part of it, the sort of spidey sense bit, is sort of getting something in your hand and you can tell it's trying to be London. It's based on a London design, but they're not quite hitting the mark. And so it feels a bit odd, a bit crude, and you can sort of sense that when handling. So I hope that helps a little bit. Thank you.
Luke, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I really very much appreciate it, and you've made wonderful progress with your research. First of all, I want to thank you for finding a pineapple in there, Matthias Holst. I really want to look at that sign that you found, because it's one of the earliest images of that type that I would say had been located in Bridgetown for the period. But I do want to make a couple of other points. I think that you touched on, for example, the work of Isaac Lopez. In my notes that I forwarded to you, I cut out a reference to Isaac Lopez. One of the key pieces of research that's going on right now that we are just about to publish within the next year or so is work on the Jewish population in Bridgetown, and Isaac Lopez is specifically mentioned as silversmith in the city. And in answer to a previous colleague's question about whether the spaces were rented or not, I would say that if we are able to trace one or two individuals like him, one can see movement of Lopez from this building to that building, on this street to that street, sometimes owning, sometimes renting. So it's clear to me that there is that real possibility of the space being created that way. So I think that one's important aspect, and his ownership of gift. Oh my goodness, that is a story that has to emerge properly. I did want to say to our colleague over here, Catherine, I think there's very real likelihood that Solomon Saldana is Jewish. Yeah, definitely. Right. And one of the key things that I wanted to add to a previous comment, I can't remember who made that, is that and you, I think you had made it yourself, we can't see these spaces in isolation. We actually see movement of makers and retailers from one island to the next, from the Caribbean space to the North American space and back, and continuing trade going on and on. Gifts being given between Barbados and England, and trade that circulates well beyond the actual exclusive use of the local market. So I think there's a lot that needs to happen to do joined up research throughout the region and North America at the very least. Thank you.
All really important points, thank you, and I look forward to collaborating with you. Just to clarify on the pineapple, I have to admit my sins. That was a mock-up I did of the sign because I couldn't find one. But nevertheless, we can talk pineapples on another date.
Luke, that was gripping, thank you. Really fantastic. So I just want to pursue that pineapple for a minute with Matthias Holst. And you say, now at the Pine and Pearl in Cheapside, Bridgetown, Barbados. Bearing in mind we're just around the corner from Cheapside, do we know, was Cheapside in Bridgetown a centre for silversmithing, goldsmithing, jewellery as it was here? Do you have
one of several streets, yes. I mean, they're scattered a bit around the city. But yes, all these familiar names from, of course, London streets that we see throughout the whole island.
Okay, so do we know, are there other streets in Bridgetown named after similar streets in the city and the West End, which are centres for silversmithing, goldsmithing, or was that taking it too far?
That's really interesting to do that correlation between street names and see if it bears any resemblance at all to the activities going on there. I haven't looked into that, but that's now a project I'm going to have to go away and do, so thank you, Arthur. That's brilliant. Thanks.
Last one. Last two. 1, 2. This one first. Yep.
Luke, it was a very great talk. Just one thing from my point that's crossing my mind, and as a chemist, you didn't do an elemental analysis of the metals, the local silver as opposed to imported.
It's a bit of a missing piece here, but to come, absolutely. So I'll only speculate on what I might expect, and that's that there's obviously no local regulation in terms of an assay office, but you know, the customers are expecting a certain quality, and I don't think they're going to be that much shy of sterling. No. Reality is they're going to be using what silver they can get their hands on, and that's going to be a mixture of coinage, it's going to be old plate melted down, it's going to be some imported, and so I think we're going to see a range, but I think getting as many data points as we can to be able to at least quote that range is really important, so to come.
Good, okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Where was I going next? Yeah.
Thank you, Luke. Fascinating presentation. You mentioned that George Smithson had come from Charleston, South Carolina, and I wondered if there was any more evidence of craftsmen in luxury goods coming from Charleston, which was also such an important centre. And in my experience, the South Carolina Gazette is an amazing source of information, but you probably combed it.
No, absolutely. It's interesting. We see people going in both directions. So I can think of another name, Samuel Alford, who turns up in I forget which American colony and advertising in the newspaper, late of Barbados. And so I think we are seeing quite a lot of movement of, you know, not just goods, but people, of artisans all over that region. Yep. So it'd be nice to sort of do a map and show all the sort of trajectories of these movements. But yeah, thank you.
Okay. Did you want to say something?
No, and there are lots of adulatory things I would say.
Two more. The one from the...
Oh, we might have something in the Zoom chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to comment on the migration, the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, has an online database of every 18th century artisan working in the American South. And so if you're looking specifically for a particular name anywhere in the Caribbean, you can pull it up in that database to determine if that person, in fact, worked anywhere in the American South.
I might write to you for that link, if that's okay.
Oh, it's searchable online. You can use Google.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is an online question from Ruthie Dibble. Thank you for an excellent talk. Have you found any evidence of silver made in the North American colonies retailing in Barbados?
I can't think of any can't think of any sort of advertisement specifying retailing of American-made silver. But what is clear, just viewing what silver remains on the island, absolutely, there's a lot of American colonial silver that continues to exist on the island. So it must have been, absolutely. It's a good question. Thank you.
Okay. Well done, Luke.
Thank you very much.
All that thinking, you must be exhausted.
Absolutely.
But they're really, really well.